normally on the first look, we're going to start with this main event of the evening and work our way on down from there. So it's a welterweight showcase going down in this main event. We've got Gilbert Durinho Burns looking to, stake his claim. He's a guy who's getting up there in age in this division. What does age necessitate? You got to go right now. There's no time to wait. There's no time to waste. There's not really margin for error at this point in his career. I would say one more loss at this level has essentially ended any kind of title hopes for Gilbert Burns, right? If he loses this fight to Sean Brady, it's very difficult to imagine any path back to a title shot for Gilbert Burns, because then we're talking about a guy who's, in his mid 38, right? Middle of 38. And he's a guy that would be coming off then, a number of losses, a number of setbacks against young guys in the division that would be due opportunities. So when you look at a guy like Gilbert Burns, this is kind of, a really must-win fight for him, right? He can't afford to lose this fight at this stage of his career. You look at his last fight, he got knocked out by Jack Della Maddalena, and that's tough. He was having some good success in that fight. He was having his moments. He was getting to some good grappling positions. However, I think that we saw him take a lot of damage over the course of that fight. I think we saw his toughness get tested. He's a very tough individual, but the human body can only take so much. The human spirit can only take so much. And he got hit badly, got hit hard in that fight. And, that last knee really crumbled him. He got hurt, and Jack got on top of him and was relentless, brutal with those elbows, and it could have really done a lot of damage to a guy like Gilbert Burns. And especially as you get up there in age, what is one thing that we constantly stress on this show? We read books, right? We try and learn, we try and read the data. We try and just see, what we can take away from previous fights, from previous experience, and try and draw from that to make better decisions in the future. And one thing that we note in the book Fightnomics, after 38 years of age, that's when fighters tend to start getting knocked out at a much higher rate, at a much more alarming rate. And you see it's a steep increase at 38 years of age. So that's something we want to watch on the Gilbert Burns side. Not only is he 38 years of age, he's coming off of a brutal knockout loss. So that's something that we want to keep our eye on. Now, everything's about matchups in mixed martial arts. Is Sean Brady necessarily the guy who's going to test your chin? Is he the guy who's going to go out there and try and, swing hammers with you on the feet? Maybe not. So maybe you think it's a forgiving matchup for Gilbert in that way. But we want to talk about this, like I said, from every angle. So the first angle is we got to talk about where Gilbert's at in his career. He's 38 years of age. That's a concern. He's coming off a knockout loss. That's a little bit concerning. And, he is the guy that you have to think promotionally. He's at a point in his career where he's been in a lot of these big fights. One thing I want to note, and I did note this on Patreon a few days ago in the chat, was if you look at Gilbert Burns' career, this guy has spent, a virtual eternity fighting on UFC pay-per-views. And I think that that's something that you want to note about this guy. UFC 299, he's on the pay-per-view. That was the O'Malley card. UFC 288, he was on the Sterling and Cejudo card in Newark, New Jersey. UFC 287, Pereira versus Adesanya 2. He was on that card against Jorge Masvidal. I want to say that was in Miami. UFC 283, the Teixeira versus Hill card. I think that was in Brazil, and he was able to go out there and get the submission over Neil Magny. Cashed us a nice plus 230 ticket in that spot. UFC 273, Khamzat Chimaev, he fought him there. He's been fighting on pay-per-view after pay-per-view. This man has been in big fights. Now he's stepping back into this smaller venue, right? He's going back to the Apex Center, and this is a guy that's had some success in the Apex Center. I believe he beat Tyron Woodley in the Apex Center. When you look back, I'm trying to think if he had another fight, another contest there. I think it was in Brazil, actually. Yeah, he fought in Brazil against Damian Maia, but because it was an empty arena, I thought that it was in the Apex, right? It was back during COVID times. This guy, Gilbert Burns, has been in some of these smaller, low-key shows and had some success. Like I said, big win over Tyron Woodley. He was able to defeat him over 5 rounds. We know that Woodley maybe wasn't big on volume late in his career, let's say charitably, right? He didn't go out there and throw a lot, but Gilbert Burns also disciplined it, right? He hit him hard in the early going. He was able to get to his own wrestling positions against Tyron Woodley. So we saw a lot of positive success from Gilbert in that fight. And also he won over 5 rounds. That's going to be a test for Gilbert Burns, right? If you look back through his career, if you had to make a criticism, I tweeted a long time ago that Gilbert Burns, in my notes, against Alexei Konchenko, against Prajeris, against a few guys, you saw a noticeable drop-off in the third round. I think a lot of that had to do with him cutting to 155 pounds. But I think some of that has to do with the way he fights. He throws a lot of power in his shots early. He goes out there and commits to wrestling heavy game plans at times where he's spending a lot of energy trying to get the fight to the ground. And all of those things can leave you taxed in terms of your energy systems. And what is another thing at 38 years of age that could be taxed? Your energy systems, right? It can be harder to keep your cardio as effective. Now, if you guys are deep in the MMA lore like I am, then you've heard the video of Gilbert Burns basically saying, he's like, yeah, I found some new stick. And then he just like cuts himself off and doesn't say it. But I believe that he got on some very good supplementation. Let's call it that. At a certain point in his career, he looks to be physically very strong now at welterweight. He looks to be, having a little bit better cardio as his career has gone on, right? And again, normally it's an inverse relationship, right? The older you get, the worse your cardio is, typically speaking. It's not been the case for Gilbert. I would argue his cardio has gotten noticeably better at times over some of these fights. Where are the other concerns, though, for Gilbert? It's not only is he getting hurt, knocked out, he got injured early against Belal Muhammad, right? The physicality of Belal, the technique of Belal was able to stuff him, was able to force his shoulder down to the mat. And you could call that unfortunate. You could call it, bad luck, right? But also it's a fight. And at the end of the day, you're trying to hurt each other, right? And so when Gilbert was going for takedowns, Belal was trying to, cut a hard angle with the hips, run his shoulder into the mat, hit him hard, put pressure on it. And he was able to put Gilbert in a bad situation. If you guys remember, before that fight, I was bullish on Belal Muhammad, but unfortunately, there was a rumor going around that Belal's foot was injured. And if you looked, there was like video of him like kind of being limber on his foot. And there was also pictures of Belal with bruising all over his foot. And it looked like he had something broken. It looked like he might have had like a rolled ankle, of a really serious kind. Like there was something visibly wrong with him going into that fight. And he was able to clutch up on short notice and all these things and just make it happen, right? But if you remember, Gilbert was tasked with going very quickly back to back. He fought Jorge Masvidal to a 15-minute unanimous decision in April. And then less than 1 month later, he's in there with Belal, remember the name Muhammad. And remember, guys, Belal then goes on to win the UFC title, his very next fight. So Gilbert Burns is still a guy who's been right on the precipice. And both guys could kind of claim, hey, that wasn't my best work. Did he get shut out a little bit by Belal Muhammad? Yes, he did. But is that a fight that with, some different changes to your game plan with a little bit less injuries on both sides that you could see a slightly different result? I think that there is that case, right? Or at least that's the case that Gilbert would want to make, right? Go out there, let me get another chance. I can knock this guy out. I could submit him. And it's not going to be easy for him to get a title shot. You got Shavkat waiting in the wings. You got a Kamaru Usman who's trying to weasel his way back in. You got all these different guys trying to make their play at welterweight, including the guy who just knocked him out, Jack Della Maddalena. But injuries are a thing in the UFC. Timing is a thing in the UFC. Who your manager, all these different things play a big part in who gets these title fights, who gets the big opportunities. And a guy like Gilbert Burns, who's been on a lot of pay-per-views, who said yes a lot of times, who's gone out there and taken a lot of hard fights, he is a guy that I think has been kept in the UFC's good graces. Why do they keep running his brother out there to get beat up for a check? I don't know, but I think it might have something to do with the fact they like Gilbert, they respect him, they want to give him that benefit of the doubt, they want to, show a little love and respect to a guy who's had all these fights in the UFC. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about Gilbert Burns, and he's got a lot of great accolades. He's got a lot of great skills. The one thing we haven't done is we haven't talked a ton about his wins. We talked about some of the setbacks, some of the recent performances where he struggled, but I mentioned the fact that he beat Jorge Masvidal. He went out there and just controlled a guy who was basically ready to retire, did what he needed to do, got the win, earned the win, but it wasn't remarkable. The Neil Magny performance, I called it a shark versus a fish, right? You just have a guy who's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt of a very high level, a guy who's extremely serious about his grappling game. And then you look at a guy, like Gilbert Burns going out there against Neil Magny. Neil Magny physically didn't have enough to resist him. And we had seen guys like Rafael Dos Anjos show this hole in his game, take him down, bully mentality, get to top position, step 1, step 2, step 3, and it's over. And we saw Shavkat Rakhmonov able to replicate similar success. When you are a plus shark level grappler that can take the fight to the mat, Neil Magny is a fish for those type of guys, right? He's a very tough out in the middle of the pack in the division, but those top echelon grapplers, they just make mincemeat out of him on the mat. And I think that when you look at, the Gilbert fight, that was an example. One thing that goes unremarked upon, but that's always stood out to me about Gilbert Burns is the respect that Khamzat Chimaev had for this man on the ground. When you look back, guys, Gilbert Burns and Khamzat Chimaev had a hell of a fight. It's one that you could go back and rewatch. It's a great rewatchable fight. And when you watch that fight, there was a lot of competitive moments. But one of the things that really stood out is Khamzat Chimaev got to his takedown. And that was my question in the matchup. I was like, what will Khamzat go get takedowns? Will he try to take this guy down? Because it's not an easy proposition to go out there and say, I'm going to get on top of this guy and hold him down when you know that Gilbert can throw up these dangerous submissions. He's got a great arm bar. He's a very dexterous player in all positions, right? And he's been around the game for a long time. He's very creative in his grappling. Need I remind people that he was able to scramble up from the bottom mount against Damian Maia, get back to his feet, and then knock him silly. So you see that Gilbert Burns really has this ability to create dynamic scrambles on the mat. And Khamzat Chimaev did go for one takedown. And he got to the top position, and he basically realized, like, yo, I'm not comfortable here. I'm not safe here. I don't want to be here. And he got the fight to the ground and instantly stood right back up, got out of the guard of Gilbert Burns. And I thought that spoke volumes to just what he was feeling. If he felt like I could just take this guy down, pass his guard, and dominate, then that's one thing. But if I didn't feel that way, if I don't think he's going to go out there and just get to, the best positions, then I think that's something where a guy like Khamzat Chimaev, he's a very high level grappler. He's a very sound guy. He can wrestle. He can get to these positions. If he's not wanting to be there, that's telling me he's expecting some really high level resistance. And he knows, hey, I'm putting myself in some danger here. I don't want to be here. And this is a guy, keep in mind, that was getting touched up a little bit on the feet. So if your risk calculation is, it's scarier to go on the ground with this guy than it is to go on the feet where we're slanging it out and having a crazy back and forth war, that for me is something that speaks volume. So I think that Gilbert Burns worthy of a lot of respect. The Stephen Wonderboy Thompson fight, did it tell us a ton? I don't think it did, but he did go out there and just show that he could go out there and put on a wrestling performance, go out there and use his skill set to neutralize a striker. And then you see the Kamaru Usman fight. I reposted a video from that fight where Gilbert comes out and he's landing big shots. He's getting to work upstairs. He's throwing big hands. And just seemed like he spent himself too early, right? He thought he had something going and he was throwing 100% power into all his shots. But I think the other thing that gets unremarked upon about that fight is it was extremely emotional for both guys. These are two guys that had trained together for a long time. They had experience with each other in the practice room. And, it's a tough thing to go out there and fight, blood and guts with a guy that you've sweat with, bled with, that you're friends with, and that's what they had to do. And they had to distance themselves from each other in training. And they had to basically put themselves in different camps and different situations in order to facilitate that. And that's uncomfortable, right? It kind of just drives a wedge in between friends and training partners. And the UFC is more than happy doing that, right? Dana's always said that. If you want to be the best, you want to be the best. That's what he believes in. So he's always going to match these training partners together and just say, one of you comes out alive. Like we just don't do friendships here, right? And that's why he hates Aljo. That's why he hates Merab in some ways, right? Because they had that code, that respect for each other. They don't want to sell that out for a couple, $1 million. And they have that kind of team loyalty and integrity. And it's just rare to see that, right? We've seen it all the way back, Rashad and John Jones, right? Training partners turned bitter rivals. The UFC loves that narrative. They love that storyline. They love to push that. So I think that when you saw Gilbert out there, throwing from the hip and trying to kill him, there was some resentment, some animosity, like, man, it's my goal and my dream. You're trying to take this away from me. And, it's tough, man. It's tough. And when you saw that fight, they were both very emotional as it ended. They were both crying essentially. It was a tough thing for them to go out there and do. So you look at Gilbert, he's had a very tough road. He had won a lot of fights prior to that, but they weren't all easy. And now he's taken on a lot of these tough challenges. How many times can he find that, perseverance, that ability to dig deep? That's a question coming into this matchup. But now let's talk about some of these intangibles as we kick it over to the Brady side. We're looking at a Sean Brady who's going to possess a 1.5-inch reach advantage, 72.5 inches, according to Tapology, compared to just 71 for Gilbert Burns. They're standing 5'10" apiece, so height parity in this matchup. And then you're looking at a 31-year-old going on 32 in Sean Brady, compared to 38 years of age for Gilbert Durinho Burns. So for me, this is a fascinating matchup. And Sean Brady is a guy that I've bet on a few times in the UFC. The time that I made a huge mistake, I faded Belal Muhammad with Sean Brady. I thought that Sean was going to be able to get takedowns. I thought he was going to be able to implement his will from the top position. And I couldn't have been more wrong about that, right? We've seen that Belal has very good takedown defense. Belal is a guy that is willing to come forward and pressure makes it a little more difficult for most MMA wrestlers to get off on their game. They prefer to have their own, ability to create entries. And when you're constantly being forced backwards, it kind of forces the shots out of you in a way that makes them a little bit more predictable, as opposed to when you're able to put some punches in front of it, get somebody moving backwards, and then fire off a wrestling attack. It makes it a little bit easier and higher percentage. When you look at a guy like Sean Brady, he's a very MMA-centric wrestler and grappler in a lot of ways. And what I mean by that is he's very strong, and he's able to push people back to the fence. So you see him throw like an overhand type, right hand, right? Like he'll be setting up his shots, he'll be moving like boxing range, throw an overhand, and then try and run the person to the fence where he is able to secure a double leg, where he's able to get to his offense and kind of work from there. He's very physically strong, like I mentioned. So once he's able to back people up to the fence, oftentimes it's easy for him to scoop grip, get the legs out from underneath him, and he's very heavy with the top pressure. We've seen him go out there and get a mounted guillotine finish over, I think it was Christian Aguilera in the UFC, where he literally choked him to sleep from the top mount. No questions asked, like twitching on the ground type. It was a serious choke that he applied, and you could see the torque, the leverage he's able to create. He also went out there against jiu-jitsu black belt Jake Matthews, the Celtic kid. He's able to get on top of him. He's able to create a lot of pressure, a lot of shoulder pressure on Matthews. He's able to squeeze him, and eventually you see Matthews, a guy who's pretty composed on the ground, generally speaking, starts to get a little flustered, starts to make a couple mistakes. He's able to pass to that head and arm choke, and he's able to get the finish. So you see that this guy has a lot of different ways that he can get the fight done. He's got the guillotine choke. He's got the rear naked chokes on his record as well. And he can also wrestle to a decision. Now, the concern for a guy like Sean Brady is what we saw in the Belal Muhammad fight, which is he wasn't able to get off on his wrestling and his grappling. And then his game kind of fell apart, right? And we saw that the pressure was getting to him. Was it a premature stoppage? I don't know. That's up to interpretation. But what I would say is that it didn't look good, right? I didn't like anything I was seeing in terms of his reaction to the shots. He was kind of covering up and moving backwards, but he wasn't answering, and he wasn't, trying to get respect back. I thought Belal Muhammad showed him no respect in the stand-up, showed him no respect with the hands. And we've seen a couple guys do that now, and a lot of them have had success, right? When you look, there's been a couple guys that have given him resistance on the feet that you wouldn't expect. Michael Chiesa, prime example. If you go back and watch that fight, I believe I bet on Sean Brady to win that fight, but there was a couple moments in there that were a little dicey. We've seen a lot of grapplers go out there and challenge Michael Chiesa in this welterweight division and have some success. And to see a guy like Sean Brady go out there, and he was kind of getting boxed up and kind of getting, hit with the long jabs of Michael Chiesa, it kind of showed a little bit that when he can get to his office, when he can set up on top, when he can be in a dominant position, he's a great fighter and a very assertive fighter and a very effective technical fighter. He knows what to do on the ground. He knows how to advance his position. He knows where his bread is buttered. He's a very, very dangerous guy. But you have to recognize as well that when he's not able to put it in those positions, we've definitely seen a different a different level of competitiveness, right? When he's able to take Kelvin Gastelum down every round, it's just easy money, easy work, putting the guy through the paces until the fight's over. But when you're not able to get to the top position, when you're not able to, to assert yourself in those ways, it does become a lot dicier of a proposition. And I think that when you have a guy like Kelvin Gastelum, who's been a career mark to the submission, if you look back at his career, Kelvin Gastelum, he's never been finished via strikes in the UFC. He's been submitted 3 times. He's been submitted by Jack Hermanson. He was submitted by Chris Weidman via an arm triangle choke, and then he was submitted by Sean Brady. So that's good company to keep, right? Jack Hermanson, very solid jiu-jitsu player, a very solid submission grappler in the UFC. Chris Weidman, obviously a jiu-jitsu black belt, a very high-level guy. I believe he's competed at the ADCCs. Like, he is a very serious grappler in his own right, submitted a lot of guys in the UFC. So again, no skin off your nose there if you're KG, but it's been a little bit of a liability for him, right? That's been the way you finish a guy like Kelvin Gastelum, is you put him in a submission. The way he was able to audit him in the wrestling and the grappling, I did think that was pretty impressive. That was a new wrinkle. But we've also seen that Kelvin Gastelum has struggled at times with the discipline, with the game planning, with showing up the right way for the opponent at hand. And I think that he has a lot of talent, but he doesn't always realize it in the cage. He doesn't always show his best. And I just thought ultimately Sean was a tough matchup for him in how that fight played out. I think that this is a better test of where Sean Brady is at. He got his confidence back after the Bilal Muhammad fight. He went out there. That could be a real problem for a guy who was an undefeated fighter, but now he's got that pressure off his back. No longer undefeated, but he's got the confidence of a win back under his belt. I think that's important to look at coming in here. But then the ultimate question is, how do you tape study for this matchup, right? What do you want to understand in order to pick a winner here? For me, there's a couple questions. Number one, has Sean Brady made substantial improvements on the feet such that he could go out there and win this fight with Gilbert Burns in a purely stand-up contest? I think in the stand-up, Gilbert has shown himself to be a little bit more defensively responsible, which I know that sounds crazy to say, but just based on a lot of the exchanges that we've seen from Sean on the feet against Bilal Muhammad and Michael Chiesa in his recent bouts, I think that there's some cause for concern there. I think that when you look at Gilbert Burns, he's also shown himself to be a little bit more offensively potent, right? If not a lot more offensively potent. He has some knockdowns. He's got an ability to go out there and hit people with hands and change the complexion of the fight. So I think for that reason, it comes down to, for me, what is the game plan for Sean Brady? Right? If he's going to go out there, take this fight to the mat, assert himself over Gilbert Burns, say, hey, this is a welterweight against a lightweight. I'm not afraid of this guy. I'm going to hold him down. I'm going to pin him. He's not going to be able to do shit to me. If he's got that kind of confidence and that's how he's going to go approach it, okay. Like, I could kind of see him maybe pulling that off, right? He is that kind of guy. He is a very good grappler, and he is a big, strong guy at 170. But on the other side of things, if his game plan is like, I'm going to test my striking, I'm going to see what's up on the feet, and that for me would not be a bullish signal coming into this fight. And it is a great style matchup. I think the UFC found a good, interesting style clash. It gives both guys a chance to win, right? The narrative for Sean Brady being, hey, you're the younger guy. You got a chance to go out there, clean out an older guy in the division, go take his spot, kick him off a pay-per-view. You go step into those roles. But on the other side, you got a guy who's had a lot of big fight experience, a ton of hard fights in the UFC. He might be saying to himself, yo, this guy, Sean Brady's an easier opportunity for me than some of these other fights. And everything in mixed martial arts for me is matchup based. You give Sean Brady a lot of guys that can't wrestle, can't grapple on the same level that he can. He's going to go out there and take them to a place they don't want to be. He's going to make them very uncomfortable, and he's going to beat them up. But the problem is, if he can't get it there, we still don't know how it's going to fare for him, because Bilal Muhammad's the champ. You can't take anything away from him. He lost to a great fighter, and sometimes that happens. But most people don't get put away by the strikes of Bilal Muhammad, right? Most people are able to last the 15-minute distance, even if they're uncomfortable, even if they're getting beat up a little bit. And he wasn't able to do that. And that is something that you got to take a look at and say, is that something that we can write off and say, hey, it's a one-time anomalous event, it's never going to happen again? Or is that the writing on the wall of, if this guy is not in his office, if he's not in the top position, if he's not feeling comfortable in the wrestling and the grappling, things could get a little bit dicier for him on the feet. And so I hope you guys can understand. I'm coming to you trying to separate myself from any biases, because if you're coming to me with a sales pitch for a fighter, grit and guillotines, the Irish American way, he's got a name like Sean Brady and he's from the Northeast, I'm going to be riding with this kind of fighter, right? I'm going to love this kind of fighter. I'm going to root for this kind of fighter. But on the other side of things, Gilbert Burns, he's got all those same likable qualities, and he's a great championship level fighter. He's been around for a long time. I think that both of these guys are interesting contenders still in this division. I was surprised by some of the levels of success that Gilbert Burns was having against Jack Della Maddalena. Same thing against Khamzat Chimaev. The guy has continued to show he's got a willingness to go out there, scrap, compete, do whatever it takes to compete at the next level. And like I said, whether that's supplements that are within the rules or outside the rules, Gilbert Burns is trying to keep up with the Joneses, man. He's trying to find a way to keep up with these young kids and go out there and get a win that will put him back in prime position. And he's got an opponent that is probably going to be able, willing to mix it up in a phase that he's comfortable in. Before we move off of this main event, there's one other thing I want to mention on the first look, and it's the things that stood out to me, right? So I talked about one thing that stood out to me just looking at the Tapology was all the times Gilbert Burns has fought in a row on pay-per-view, finally moving off of pay-per-view for this fight. Then you look at the other side. What stands out about Sean Brady, if you just look at his Tapology? Cancellations. The guy has just struggled to stay healthy, and this is something that you want to just you're not making light of it, right? You're just wishing him the best. But he had a canceled bout against Vicente Luque in March, unable to compete. I believe he's had recurring staph infections in his elbow, that have been very, very serious. He had an infection that caused a cancellation to a scheduled bout with Jack Della Maddalena in July of 2023. When you look, he also had a canceled bout with Michel Demolidor Pereira. That was supposed to be in March of 2023. He had a groin injury before that fight. He had a canceled bout with Kevin Lee due to a unlisted Brady injury. And he also had a canceled bout with Bilal Muhammad back in 2020 that he withdrew from. So, guys, it's been, unfortunately, a storied UFC career of inactivity and struggling to make it to the octagon due to health. And that's not something that we're wishing upon him. That's something that we're hoping he's able to overcome and he's able to move forward from. He's a Renzo Gracie guy, a local guy. I've had the privilege of, training a little bit and learning a little bit from one of his coaches for a long time, Daniel Gracie, a fascinating mind for jiu-jitsu. He was showing me some of the systems that they have for the takedowns. And I think that overall, Sean Brady has a lot of upside still. He's a young man in the game, but he still has a lot to prove to me on the feet to know that he's a guy I could trust moving forward against top echelon welterweights. I think if he has a grappling edge that he can easily exploit, that's where the matchups you want to bet him in, right? That's the matchups I feel the most comfortable backing him. But having been burnt once in 3 tries going to the window with this guy, I learned that when you got a guy like Bilal Muhammad, a guy that could stuff the takedowns, a guy that could change that dynamic, it was a whole different ball game. So for me, that's why I can't feel comfortable getting to the window at chalk with Sean Brady this week. And on the other side, Gilbert Burns, the concerns, 38 years of age, a guy that in his own right has dealt with some health problems, some injuries, things like this. So I think that both guys have a lot to prove here, and it should be a fun, great main event as a result. If you like jiu-jitsu, if you like welterweight scraps, if you like good action, I think that you're in for a treat. I think this should be a great main event.